Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
It started like every Thanksgiving for the past 10 years, 10 smiles, careful hugs, and that obligatory, good to see you tone everyone used when what they really meant was, let's get through this, without someone crying in the bathroom. My sister Vanessa had already arrived when I pulled into the driveway, her sleek black Audi parked in the same spot. She always demanded the front, right near the door, because, as she put it once with a laugh and no shame, heels don't do gravel, babe. I parked behind her, not even bothering to hide my sigh. Walking up the path with my backpack slung over one shoulder and a pumpkin pie I baked the night before balanced in one arm, I already knew this year wouldn't be any different from the rest, or at least, I thought I knew. The house still smelled like Mom's signature sage stuffing and that overly sweet cinnamon candle she always lit around the holidays, even though it gave most of us a headache. Dad greeted me with a stiff half-hug and a "you look tired, kid," which in our family was close to affection. I gave him a smile anyway. Mom just waved at me from the kitchen without turning around, her apron already covered in what looked like flour and cranberry sauce, and muttered something about the green beans needing attention. Nothing changes. Not in this house. Vanessa was standing near the wine rack, swirling something red in one of Mom's fancy glasses that she probably brought herself. She wore a sharp navy dress that screamed boardroom, her hair perfectly curled and her nails a glossy beige, expensive looking in that intentionally subtle way rich women love. She spotted me, raised an eyebrow like she was surprised I even showed up, and offered a smile that was about as warm as a frozen waffle. "Rachel," she said, her voice already carrying that drawl of passive aggression she's perfected since college. "Still driving that Subaru? That's brave." I laughed, more out of instinct than amusement, and set the pie down on the counter, already wishing I had poured a drink before walking in. "Yep. Still gets me from one eco-disaster to the next." She smirked and turned back to her wine, clearly satisfied with her little jab. It wasn't even noon, and she was already sharpening the knives. Dinner was exactly what you'd expect, a careful dance of politics, backhanded compliments, and everyone pretending the world was just fine. Mom asked about Vanessa's new firm in Boston, gushed over how proud she was that her daughter was finally doing real law, and reminded the table how Vanessa had always been the one with drive. Vanessa, gracious as ever, downplayed it with faux modesty while casually mentioning her six-figure bonus, her private Pilates instructor, and the new townhouse she was in the process of buying with her boyfriend, Andrew, or, as she called him, Drew, because apparently shortening names makes everything sound more elite. And then, inevitably, the attention turned to me. It always did. Like clockwork. Mom looked across the table, her fork pausing midair, and asked, "And you, Rachel? Still doing that, research thing? You're with the forest people." "Environmental data modeling," I said, trying not to grit my teeth. "Working on a new predictive tool for groundwater contamination related to agrochemical runoff. We just launched phase 2. There was a pause, one of those silences that says more than words ever could. Vanessa snorted softly into her wineglass, and without looking up, she dropped the grenade. "Some of us chose real degrees." I felt the sting before the words even fully landed, like she'd reached across the table and flicked me in the center of the forehead just to see if I'd flinch. The room shifted. Dad coughed into his napkin. Mom went back to slicing her turkey. And I just sat there for a beat too long, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or finally say the things I'd been swallowing for a decade. But then, out of nowhere, Uncle Tom, who hadn't said more than 5 words since Grace, leaned forward in his chair, tilted his glass, and looked straight at Vanessa, then back to me with this half-smile he used to give us as kids when we were being little terrors. And he asked, with his voice steady and a little too casual to be accidental, "Is that why the governor just gave you a research grant?" You could hear a pin drop. For real. Even the goddamn turkey seemed to stop sizzling in its juices. Vanessa's smile froze. Mom blinked, fork in midair. Dad looked up like he'd just realized he was part of a conversation. And me? I didn't say a damn thing. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in forever, I wasn't the one explaining, defending, or pretending I didn't care. I just watched the confusion and quiet indignation creep across Vanessa's perfect face like a slow leak in a luxury yacht. Uncle Tom reached for the mashed potatoes, still as chill as ever, and added, "Saw your name in the report last week." Big deal. Governor's Environmental Innovation Fund doesn't just throw money around. What was it, $500,000 in seed funding? I nodded, still not speaking, because it was better to let the silence say it for me. Vanessa's eyes darted toward Mom, then to me, then back to her plate, like someone trying to calculate whether this was a joke or a humiliation. Mom gave a tight smile, one she probably didn't mean to look so forced, and muttered something about how wonderful that is. But the tone had changed. Permanently. For the rest of dinner, no one brought up degrees. No one asked about jobs. Vanessa stayed quiet, a little too quiet, stabbing at her green beans like they owed her money. And I sat there eating cranberry sauce with a calm I hadn't felt at this table in years. Thing is, I never cared about showing off. I didn't want to rub anything in anyone's face. I just wanted them to stop pretending I was the family disappointment because I hadn't married a plastic dentist or become some firm's PR darling. But something about that moment, about the look on Vanessa's face, that flicker of shock and disbelief, it flipped something in me. Because maybe I was done staying quiet. And maybe I had a lot more up my sleeve than just a government grant. Even though the moment had passed, the air at the dinner table still heavy with the scent of turkey, buttered rolls, and simmering tension, I couldn't shake the echo of Vanessa's words. That cutting little line she delivered with all the subtlety of a champagne flute hurled at a wall. Some of us chose real degrees. The room might have gone quiet after Uncle Tom's unexpected interjection, and the power dynamic may have shifted for a few delicious minutes in my favor, but beneath the surface, I could feel the gears turning behind everyone's polite expressions, calculating how to return the balance to the way it had always been, to the natural order of things where Vanessa was the accomplished one and I was the weird academic spinster playing in the dirt with frogs and spreadsheets. I didn't respond that night, not out loud, but the memory of that moment lingered like a burn under the skin, not deep enough to scar, but just enough to keep you flinching every time someone brushed against it. Because what she said wasn't just about that night, it was the tip of a long, jagged iceberg, a structure built over years of subtle slights, backhanded compliments, and those exhausting family dinners where I always seemed to be performing a role I never auditioned for, the underachieving little sister who needed to be loved despite her strange choices. I remember the first time Vanessa made me feel small, not openly, not maliciously, just with that casual superiority she learned somewhere between her second Ivy League internship and the first time our parents introduced her as our lawyer daughter. It was at Thanksgiving too, maybe 12 or 13 years ago, when I had just finished my master's and landed a grant to study wetland restoration in North Carolina. I was thrilled, practically buzzing with excitement, because I finally felt like I was doing something meaningful, something that could actually make a difference, and I wanted to share that with the people who mattered. I brought photos, talked about fieldwork, tried to explain why swamps were more than just muddy wastelands, and Vanessa, after listening in that disinterested way she always had, leaned across the table and asked, "So you're basically a park ranger now?" She laughed, others laughed, and I laughed too, because what else do you do when your whole identity just got reduced to khaki shorts and mosquito bites? But the thing was, it stuck with me, not because I cared about being compared to a ranger, but because I knew, deep down, that she wasn't asking out of ignorance. She was asking to remind me that in her world, if it didn't come with a title, a salary bracket, and a quarterly bonus, it wasn't worth taking seriously. And the worst part? Mom agreed with her, even if she never said it outright. She tried to act supportive, sure, sent birthday cards with forest animal stickers, clipped newspaper articles about climate change like they were personally relevant to me, and once even introduced me to her church friend as our Rachel, who's doing something with water. But whenever she talked about Vanessa, her voice would lift with pride, and she'd say things like, "Vanessa just closed another deal with a telecom giant," or "Vanessa's on another board, can you believe it?" It wasn't just favoritism, it was investment. Vanessa was the return on all their hopes, and I was the strange little side project they didn't quite understand. Over the years, I learned to let it roll off. I moved to Oregon, bought a modest house near the coast, started working with a nonprofit that partnered with universities and state agencies, and lost myself in research. Real research. Not cute side project research, but the kind of data analysis that helped small towns protect their drinking water and farmers avoid lawsuits. I published papers, gave talks, even co-authored a federal proposal that got quietly absorbed into legislation, but none of that seemed to matter when I flew home for holidays and found myself being asked, over and over again, whether I'd ever thought about going corporate, as if I were just one smart decision away from real success. And maybe, for a while, I started to believe them. Not because I wasn't proud of my work, but because it's hard to feel proud when the people who raised you can't look at your life without squinting, as if trying to bring a blurry photo into focus. So when Uncle Tom mentioned the grant, when he dropped it right in the middle of the dining room like a stone in a still pond, it wasn't just vindication, it was a rupture. Not because I needed validation, but because, for once, someone in that room acknowledged that what I did mattered. And not in a pat on the head, good for you kind of way, but in a real, measurable, headline-making kind of way. What they didn't know, what they wouldn't even bother to ask, was that this grant wasn't just some ceremonial award. It was $500,000 in seed funding, spread across 3 years, tied to a high-profile initiative led by the governor's office to combat agricultural runoff in rural districts. My proposal had beaten out applications from tech firms, academic consortiums, and private contractors, because unlike them, I wasn't pitching solutions to sell, I was building tools that communities could use, for free, without bureaucracies strangling their effectiveness. And yes, it felt good to see Vanessa's expression falter, just for a second, when she realized I'd been handed something she hadn't even known was in play. It felt good to watch her eyes narrow, her lips tighten, her whole body tense like someone bracing for a punch that never came because she wasn't used to me winning. Not like this. Not without her being able to reframe it, diminish it, or spin it into something that still made her look better. But the thing was, she didn't ask a single follow-up question. Not one. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't even look at me again for the rest of the night. Because in her mind, the only way to deal with an uncomfortable truth is to ignore it until it stops being inconvenient. And my success? My work? That was inconvenient as hell. I went to bed that night in the old guest room, surrounded by the same dusty photo albums and floral wallpaper from our childhood, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time, replaying the scene at the dinner table over and over, wondering why it still mattered so much to me, why I still wanted them to see me, really see me, when it was so clear they never would. But something inside me had changed, subtly, quietly, like a tide turning in the dark. I wasn't going to fight them, not directly. I wasn't going to scream, cry, or beg for respect. I was going to let the work speak louder than I ever could. And if it hurt them to finally realize they underestimated me, well, that wasn't my problem anymore. The next morning began like so many others in that house, quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but loaded, like a room full of people holding their breath, pretending everything's fine while waiting for someone else to break the illusion. The scent of burnt toast drifted through the air, mixed with that same cinnamon candle from the night before, its sweetness now somehow sickly, like it was trying too hard to disguise the staleness underneath. I made my way to the kitchen, still in pajama pants and a faded college sweatshirt, hair tied in the kind of knot that says I'm not trying to impress anyone, and poured myself a cup of coffee, fully expecting to navigate another minefield of passive-aggressive smiles and veiled jabs. Mom was already at the stove, scraping a pan with more force than necessary, her lips pressed into a tight line that told me she hadn't forgotten the awkward moment from dinner. She didn't look at me when she spoke, just kept attacking the eggs like they owed her money, and said, "You know, Rachel, you might have given Uncle Tom the wrong idea last night. He seems to think this grant is some kind of victory lap." I stared at her back, the slope of her shoulders, the way her blouse clung slightly from the heat of the kitchen, and I realized she wasn't angry because of what I'd said. I hadn't even said anything. She was angry because, for once, someone outside this house had seen value in me, and she didn't know how to deal with that. I took a sip of coffee, let the bitter warmth settle on my tongue, and responded without raising my voice. It's not about victory. It's about work that matters. That's all it's ever been. She turned then, finally, spatula still in hand, and gave me the kind of smile that looks like a grimace wearing a mask of politeness. Of course it matters, honey. It's just, well, not everyone understands what it is you actually do. Maybe next time, just explain it in simpler terms. Make it more approachable. And there it was again, that same exhausting refrain I'd heard in one form or another for years. Make yourself smaller. Make yourself simpler. Don't challenge people with your weird career or your obscure research. Be digestible. Be quiet. Be like Vanessa. But before I could reply, Vanessa appeared in the doorway, looking immaculate as always, in some kind of designer athleisure set that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She wasn't wearing makeup, but somehow still looked camera-ready, and as she walked in and casually kissed Mom on the cheek, I felt that old knot of irritation tighten in my chest. The one that formed every time she waltzed into a room and everyone just shifted toward her without realizing it, like planets realigning themselves around the sun. She didn't look at me, not at first. She just poured herself a glass of orange juice, leaned against the counter with that insufferable casual elegance, and finally turned her eyes in my direction with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. So, she said, dragging the word out like she was about to introduce a topic on a talk show. Heard your little Grant got mentioned in the governor's weekly memo. That's cute. I didn't respond immediately because I'd learned the hard way that Vanessa thrived on reactions, especially mine, and giving her one was like feeding a stray cat that would just keep coming back, claws sharper each time. But I couldn't let it slide, not after everything. So I set down my coffee slowly, met her gaze directly, and said, it's not little. And it's not cute. It's strategic funding tied to environmental policy reform. But I wouldn't expect you to know what that means. The smile dropped. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see it. A flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear, buried beneath all that arrogance. But she recovered fast, too fast, and shot back, oh sweetie. Just don't forget who you're talking to. I negotiate federal contracts for a living. And there it was, her favorite trick. Whenever she felt threatened, she'd retreat to the fortress of her job title, her salary, her polished resume, as if those things were armor no one could penetrate. It didn't matter that her firm was currently under quiet investigation for ethical violations, something she hadn't told the family yet, something I'd learned through a colleague who used to clerk for the state attorney's office. No, Vanessa still believed she was untouchable, that she could keep lobbing grenades from her high tower without ever worrying about someone throwing one back. I didn't say what I knew. Not yet. That would come later, when it mattered more. Instead, I picked up my coffee again, turned toward the window, and said calmly, if you ever want to understand what I do, you could ask. But I'm not going to keep explaining myself just to make you feel better about your choices. She didn't reply. Mom coughed awkwardly and went back to her eggs. And for a moment, the kitchen was filled with the sound of sizzling oil and the hum of a refrigerator, and nothing else. Later that day, as the family gathered in the living room to watch football and pretend we were all still close-knit and functional, I sat quietly in the corner, scrolling through my emails on my phone and pretending not to notice Vanessa whispering something to Mom while side-eyeing me across the room. I didn't care what she said. I didn't care if Mom agreed. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was that I had just confirmed a speaking slot at a regional policy conference in 2 weeks, a slot I'd been offered because of the grant, the data, and the pilot results we'd submitted just before the holiday. And Uncle Tom, who sat on the board of the very committee overseeing that conference, had already promised that press would be in attendance and that several high-level state officials were planning to be there, including one whose campaign Vanessa's firm had quietly funded during the last cycle. I wasn't planning revenge, not in the way they might imagine. I wasn't out to destroy anyone, or make a scene, or throw a tantrum in front of the entire family. But I was planning something. A reveal. A shift. A reminder that you can only ignore someone's success for so long before it finds its way into the spotlight anyway. And when it did, when my name showed up in the same sentences as the words policy impact and state funding transparency, I had a strong suspicion Vanessa's world would get just a little smaller. Not because I forced it to, but because she'd spent too many years believing hers was the only world that mattered. It's a strange thing, the way people who've spent their whole lives looking down on you begin to shift uncomfortably the moment you rise to eye level, not even higher, not even with an ounce of arrogance, but just level, just even, just capable of standing in the same room without asking for permission to exist. And when you add the fact that they've built their identities on your presumed smallness, any sign that you've outgrown the little box they crafted for you starts to feel, to them, like betrayal. Vanessa had always held her position in the family like a title, not a role. She was the successful one, the stable one, the adult in a house full of emotional children. And I was useful only in comparison, the mirror she looked into when she needed to remind herself that she had won something no one else had even realized was a contest. The tension had simmered since Thanksgiving dinner, carrying through into the following days like a smoke that lingered in the drapes long after the fire had gone out. It was quiet, mostly, Vanessa keeping her comments brief and polished, Mom avoiding eye contact whenever the topic of my work came up, and Dad sinking further into the background with his usual strategy of nodding and then pretending he hadn't heard anything at all. I spent most of those days in town, claiming I needed to check in with work, when in reality I was meeting with a journalist who had reached out after seeing my name on the preliminary list of speakers for the upcoming policy conference. The article would be short, just a 3-minute spotlight segment in the local news cycle, but it would be picked up by the state's media syndicate, and more importantly, it would run the day after Thanksgiving, meaning it would air while I was still at the house, sitting across from the people who had spent decades trying to write me out of my own story. And I didn't do it to be petty, not really. I didn't chase the cameras or beg for the attention or pay for coverage the way Vanessa had done when her firm landed a merger deal 3 years ago, and suddenly she was quoted in 3 different business magazines, all of which happened to be owned by the same PR firm her boss had on retainer. No, I did it because it was time. Because I was tired of explaining. Because I wanted to put the truth in a place where it couldn't be twisted or ignored, where it had weight and permanence and visibility. But Vanessa, of course, could smell intention like a bloodhound. And it didn't take long before she cornered me. It happened on the back patio, the day before we were all scheduled to leave. The sky was that muted gray you get just before it snows, thick with anticipation but not quite ready to break. I'd come out to breathe, to stand still for 5 minutes without someone's voice wrapping around my spine like wire. She followed me without a word, standing at the far end of the deck, arms crossed, face unreadable in the late afternoon light. "So," she said finally, voice flat, eyes sharp. "You're making quite a show of things this year." I didn't look at her, not at first, because I knew she hated that. Vanessa was the kind of person who needed eye contact to feel in control, to measure your reaction like a stock price. I kept my gaze on the line of bare trees at the edge of the yard, let her words settle between us, and then replied, slowly, calmly, "It's not a show. It's just life. Mine. It's finally getting attention because it's finally being seen." She laughed, short, bitter, humorless. "Don't play the humble card, Rachel. You've been sitting on this for weeks, probably longer. That grant, the conference, the interviews, I'm not stupid. You timed it. And maybe I had. Maybe, in some part of myself I rarely let see daylight, I had waited for this exact moment, not because I needed to rub it in, but because I needed them all to stop pretending they didn't know who I really was." "I didn't time anything," I said, turning toward her now, locking eyes. "I just stopped hiding." Her expression flickered, not with anger, but with something closer to panic, though she'd never admit it. Vanessa had built her identity brick by brick from things she could measure: degrees, promotions, real estate, dinner parties with influential men who used her as a face for their own ambition, and I had become, without warning, a crack in her foundation. A reminder that value doesn't always come dressed in business casual with a LinkedIn endorsement and a mortgage. "You think you're better than me now?" she asked, and this time her voice cracked, just enough to let something real slip through. "You think one grant and a couple of headlines make you important?" I should have said no. I should have told her it wasn't a competition, that success is subjective, that we're all just trying to do the best we can with the cards we're dealt. But I didn't. Because the truth is, I didn't think I was better, I just didn't think she was better anymore. And for her, that was the real betrayal. I think I'm tired of pretending I'm less than I am just to make you feel more than you are, I said, and there was no anger in it, only exhaustion. That's not on me anymore, Vanessa. She stood there for a long moment, like she might say something else, like she might scream or cry or throw the glass in her hand against the railing. But she didn't. She just turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind her with a softness that felt more final than a slam. The next morning, the news segment aired. We were all in the kitchen again, drinking coffee, pretending to be normal, when Uncle Tom pulled it up on his phone and placed it in the center of the table. It was short, polished, respectful. They talked about the grant, about the environmental model I'd designed, about the communities that had already begun using it to test local water quality. They included a clip from the governor's office, a soundbite about public-private partnerships and grassroots innovation. They pronounced my name correctly. No one said anything for the first 20 seconds. Then Mom mumbled something about how nice it was to see our Rachel on TV. Vanessa didn't speak at all. But I didn't need her to, because I saw the way her jaw clenched. I saw the twitch in her temple. I saw the unraveling. Later that afternoon, I packed my things, said goodbye, and got in my car without ceremony. I didn't hug Vanessa. She didn't offer. But I left with something I hadn't brought with me, a kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission, a steadiness that doesn't need applause. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud. It doesn't scream, or burn bridges, or leave casualties behind. Sometimes, it just walks away standing taller than it ever has before, calm, visible, and finally free. It was almost poetic, really, the way the weather broke the morning of the conference, with the sun rising slowly over a landscape glazed in frost, the pale light catching in every brittle tree branch and reflecting off the frozen grass like the world had been dipped in glass overnight. I remember sitting alone in my car for a long moment outside the building, staring through the windshield as the steam from my breath fogged the glass, hands clenched loosely around the steering wheel, not because I was nervous, but because I was trying to hold still everything that had been building inside me for years, every ignored accomplishment, every smirk, every patronizing "good for you," every moment I'd swallowed down the desire to stand up and say, clearly and without apology, "You're wrong about me, and you always have been." The building itself was modest by state standards, nothing like the grand, echoing halls Vanessa spent her weekdays striding through in heels that cost more than my entire conference wardrobe, but inside, it was alive with quiet electricity. The kind that hums between people who all know something important is about to happen, even if they don't yet know what it is. Policy experts, agency officials, nonprofit leads, and a handful of local politicians buzzed around the atrium, exchanging clipped greetings and business cards, their name tags swinging on lanyards that carried more weight than the people wearing them ever quite acknowledged. I took my place in the green room behind the main stage, sipping lukewarm coffee from a compostable cup, listening to the hum of the audience settling in. My name already projected on the rotating schedule, displayed on the large digital board above the entry doors. And that's when I got the text from a number I didn't have saved, but one I recognized immediately anyway. "You better be careful what you say up there. You don't know everything." No punctuation, no name, no pleasantries. But the threat, as thinly veiled as it was, didn't land the way she probably intended. Vanessa had never learned the difference between fear and clarity. She assumed that when people pulled away from confrontation, it was because they were scared of her, when most of the time, they were just exhausted by the performance. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because what Vanessa didn't realize, what she refused to believe, even now, was that the data I had helped gather, the policy tools we'd designed, and the environmental monitoring systems we'd proposed had started to uncover more than just agricultural runoff patterns and water contamination levels. They had started to connect dots that had, until now, remained comfortably separated by bureaucracy and silence. Dots that linked legislative loopholes to sudden zoning changes to real estate purchases, and real estate purchases to a cluster of investment firms with tangled roots in several high-profile legal consultancies, one of which just happened to be her employer. Now, I didn't plan it that way. I didn't set out to expose anything or anyone. All I did was follow the data, and the data didn't lie. But the moment I saw the connection, subtle, almost forgettable if you weren't looking for it, I knew this story wasn't just about water. It was about how silence lets rot grow beneath manicured surfaces, about how power cloaks itself in legitimacy until someone with enough nerve pulls back the curtain. When I walked onto that stage, applause rippling across the room with the kind of polite enthusiasm people give to someone they've only just started to respect, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, grounded. Like everything that had come before had been pointing to this exact moment, not as a climax, but as a start. The speech itself wasn't revolutionary, at least not in tone. I spoke about environmental integrity, rural resilience, the importance of accessible data platforms for underserved communities. I used graphs, maps, quotes from farmers and city planners, stories that made the room lean forward instead of check their phones. But toward the end, as the final slide faded into view behind me, a network diagram of influence chains, anonymous, but sharp, I let the truth inch forward, not by shouting it, but by naming the system it lived in. There is a pattern here, I said, my voice calm, unwavering. A convergence of environmental neglect and financial convenience that, over time, creates a feedback loop of harm. Not just to land and water, but to people. To trust. And the longer we pretend these connections are coincidental, the more complicit we become in the damage. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly. I didn't name firms. I didn't name people. I didn't have to. The right people in that room already knew. When I stepped down, the applause was different this time, not just respectful, but weighted, like they were applauding the discomfort they now carried, the questions they couldn't unhear. I didn't see Vanessa in the audience. I hadn't expected to, but I knew she'd see the replay, or the write-up, or the flurry of emails that would follow from her firm's more nervous partners. Because what I'd said wasn't private anymore. It was documented. Shared. Real. Back in the lobby, as the crowd dispersed into breakout sessions and catered lunches, Uncle Tom found me near the coat rack, his face unreadable for a moment before he broke into that familiar crooked smile. "You did good," he said simply, handing me a paper program folded neatly in half. "Might want to check your inbox this afternoon. I hear someone from the Tribune is trying to get in touch." I nodded, too tired to smile but too satisfied to hide it. And then, as I turned to leave, I felt the weight of everything I had never said to Vanessa finally fall away, not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in something cleaner, something like closure. Because she wasn't the villain. Not really. She was just another person who believed in a world where success had a single shape, a single language, a single cost. And I had chosen a different language, a different shape, a different cost. That night, alone in my house with the conference badge still dangling from my purse and the echo of my own voice still ringing in my ears, I received one final message. This time, from a private email. The subject line was blank. The content was a single sentence. "What did you do?" I didn't respond. Because by then, it wasn't about what I did. It was about who I had become. And whether or not she ever understood that, whether she ever forgave me for outgrowing the cage she'd helped build, I had finally forgiven myself for ever trying to fit inside it.